By the third night of the storm, Silver Creek Valley had disappeared. Wind tore across the flats at close to 50 miles an hour. The temperature had fallen to 20 below zero. Snow buried the fence posts and erased the line between the pasture and the sky. At the north range, a section of cedar fencing gave way. Ethan Cole tied a rope around his waist and placed the other end in Clara Whitmore's hands.
He has been sleeping for hours.
If the fence stayed open, the herd would scatter toward the ravine, and everything built that winter would be lost before sunrise.
We finally made it.
Inside the barn, 10-year-old Ben counted lantern posts through the white wall of snow, keeping his voice calm for his little brother's sake even as his own hands shook. 6-year-old Luke pressed his face into Daisy's fur and would not let go. A calf bawled in the corner stall, too weak to stand on its own. Sheriff Owen Briggs, half frozen from the ride-out, braced against a post and waited for a signal that refused to come. The rope pulled tight once. Then it went still. 6 weeks earlier, Ethan Cole had walked onto this ranch with nothing but a broken handcart and one simple request: a place for his boys to sleep. How had a single quiet favor turned into a fight to save every life on this land? Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. One night beneath the barn roof. Late September, 1888, came to Wyoming Territory early and unkind. Snow was not expected for another month, yet a fine white dust already dressed the ridges above Silver Creek Valley, and the wind carried a bite that promised more was coming. Ethan Cole pulled his handcart along the last stretch of road before the open wilderness began. Luke slept against his shoulder, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the season, his small fists curled into the collar of his father's coat. Ben walked beside the wheel, boots held together with twine, saying nothing about the miles still ahead of them, though every step showed in the way he favored his left foot. 3 ranches had already turned Ethan away that week. One had offered him work and refused to feed his sons. Another gave the boys a single night indoors before sending the family back to the road at first light. A third told him plainly, without unkindness but without mercy either, that 2 children would slow down any honest man's labor. Ethan had stopped asking why. He only kept walking, because stopping meant admitting he had nowhere left to try. The Whitmore Ranch appeared past a low rise, its barn roof sagging under old age rather than the weather. Smoke rose from the chimney of a modest house, and near the corral, a woman fought alone to close a gate that had come loose from its top hinge. Clara Whitmore was not a woman who startled easily. She had buried a husband 2 winters back, kept a ranch alive through droughts and debt collectors alike, and learned to read trouble before it reached her fence line. She saw the stranger and the 2 children approaching in the fading light, and she kept one hand resting near the old shotgun leaning against the porch rail. "Evening," Ethan said, removing his hat. Snow settled in his beard almost as soon as he spoke. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I ask one thing only. Let my boys sleep in your barn tonight. I'll earn our stay by morning, or we'll be gone before you're awake to notice." Clara studied the boys instead of the man standing before her. Luke slept despite the cold, his small hand curled tight into his father's collar. Ben, thin and quiet, had already slipped his own coat over his brother's shoulders without being asked, leaving himself in nothing but a threadbare shirt against the wind. She had every reason to send them away. A stranger with 2 children was a stranger with 2 more mouths to feed and no proof of honesty behind his words. Yet something about the older boy's small, protective gesture settled the matter in her chest before her mind had finished arguing against it. "There's a milk cow in labor," she said instead of answering him directly, nodding toward the barn. "You any good with animals, or just good with speeches?" A tired smile crossed Ethan's face, the first in days. "Better with animals, Speeches never fed anybody." "Then earn it tonight," Clara said, and pulled the gate open wide enough for a handcart and 2 tired children to pass through. Ben paused at the threshold and looked down at his twine-bound boots, then up at Clara, embarrassed. "They still work fine," he said, half apology, half pride. "Passes twine holds better than most store leather anyway." "Your PA's not wrong," Clara said, hiding a small smile as she latched the gate behind them. I've mended worse with less. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay and warm animals, and Luke stirred just enough to open one eye before deciding the shoulder he was on was still the safest place in the world. Ethan set his sons down on a bed of clean straw Clara pointed toward, tucking the thin blanket around both boys with practiced care, the kind that only comes from doing this alone for longer than he cared to admit. Neither of them understood yet that one gate, opened on a cold evening in September, was about to change the shape of 4 lives, and remind an entire valley what real neighbors owed each other. The man who worked before dawn. The calf came before midnight, weak but breathing steadily by the time Ethan finished. He worked beside Clara through the worst of it without complaint, without once asking for thanks, moving with the calm certainty that comes only from years of doing this same hard work, and expecting nothing in return but a dry place to sleep. By the time Clara woke the next morning, the broken corral gate had already been mended, its new hinge fitted with a care her own husband would have approved of. The windmill, silent for 2 winters, groaned back to life and began pulling water from the ground again. A drainage ditch near the south pasture, where a calf had gotten stuck the week before, had been filled and leveled while the household still slept. Clara stood in her yard holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hand, staring at the changes like she did not quite trust her own eyes. "You were only supposed to stay one night," she said when Ethan came around the barn, sleeves rolled and hands raw from the cold. "I did," he answered, wiping his palms on his trousers. "This was this morning." She almost smiled. "Almost. There's a whole list of things falling apart on this ranch," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "My husband kept it standing longer than I ever managed alone." "Then let me help finish what he started," Ethan said. "Not for pay. For a roof over my sons until steady work finds me somewhere down the road." Clara looked toward the barn, where Ben was already showing Luke how to coil a rope the way their father had taught him. 2 boys, laughing quietly in a yard that had been silent far too long. She had learned the hard way that kindness could be mistaken for weakness by the wrong sort of man. Still, something about Ethan's steady eyes and rough, honest hands told her he was not that kind. "One week," she said finally. "We'll see what kind of man you are by the time it's done." "Fair enough," Ethan said, and offered his hand. Clara shook it once, firm, the way she had learned to shake hands with men who tried to cheat her at market, though this handshake felt entirely different, and she did not examine why. 2 boys bring laughter back. Daisy took to the boys before Clara did. The black and white sheepdog followed Luke everywhere, and within 2 days, the 6-year-old had taught her to fetch an old boot across the yard, laughing every time she brought back the wrong one on purpose, tail wagging like she understood the joke. Ben proved handy with tools, quick to learn, and careful with the animals in a way that surprised Clara for a boy his age. He asked about her late husband's methods, not out of nosiness, but because he wanted to do the work correctly. She found herself explaining things she had not spoken aloud in 2 years, and the telling did not hurt the way she had feared it might. In the evenings, the ranch house filled with sounds it had been missing. Luke's laughter over supper. Ben's careful questions about the stars and why the mountains turned pink at sunset. Ethan's low voice reading from an old worn book by lamplight while his sons drifted to sleep on either side of him. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway one night, a dish towel forgotten in her hands. "They're good boys," she said when Ethan noticed her standing there. "Their mother raised them right before she passed," he said quietly. "I've only tried not to ruin what she started." "You haven't," Clara said, and meant every word of it. Martha Dawson, an elderly widow who lived 2 ranches over and never missed a chance to visit, arrived the following afternoon with a basket of fresh bread and an opinion nobody had asked her for. "A ranch needs more than one pair of hands, Clara Whitmore," Martha said, watching Ethan mend a fence line in the distance with an approving eye. "And a house needs more than silence to feel like a home again." "He's only staying until he finds steady work elsewhere," Clara said, though the words felt less true each time she spoke them. Martha raised one grey eyebrow. "Then you'd better hope, dear, that he's slow at finding it." Luke chose that exact moment to run past chasing Daisy, shrieking with laughter loud enough that both women turned to watch, and Clara found she could not argue with Martha's point even if she had wanted to. A ranch worth saving. October brought colder mornings and harder truths. Ethan spent his days preparing the ranch for a winter that felt closer than the calendar promised. He built windbreaks along the northern pasture from old timber nobody else had bothered to use, moved the feed storage to higher ground away from flood paths, and taught Ben how to read the sky for coming weather. Cattle need shelter before the wind changes, not after, Ethan told his son, pointing toward the darkening clouds building over the far ridge. A rancher who waits for the storm to arrive has already lost half his herd before he's finished buttoning his coat. Ben nodded seriously, repeating the lesson under his breath like he meant to remember it forever. Clara listened more than she let on. Her husband had known these things once, but 2 winters of grief had let half the ranch's old lessons slip away with him into the ground. Watching Ethan teach her land back to health, and teach Ben alongside it, felt like watching pieces of her old life return, gentler than she had any right to expect. She began paying Ethan a fair wage, though he protested when she first offered it. "You've done more for this ranch in 3 weeks than most hired hands manage in a full season," she told him, placing coins in his palm despite his objection. "Pride is a fine thing, Ethan Cole, but pride won't feed your sons through January." Ethan accepted it slowly, though something in his tired eyes told her the money mattered less than the offer itself. For the first time since losing Lydia, someone had looked at him and seen a man worth investing in, not a burden to be tolerated for one charitable night and forgotten by morning. That evening, working side by side mending a saddle strap on the porch, their hands brushed over the same length of leather, and neither pulled away as quickly as good sense might have suggested. "You're staring," Clara said, not looking up from her stitching. "Just admiring good work," Ethan said, and she was fairly certain he was not talking about the saddle. The price of greed. Jeremiah Blackwell owned the largest ranch in Silver Creek Valley, and he intended to own more of it before winter's end. He arrived at Clara's gate on a grey afternoon astride a horse worth more than most families' entire herd, dressed in a tailored coat that had never once brushed against a fence post. "Widow Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat with more show than respect behind it. "I hear you've taken in strays." "I've hired good help," Clara answered flatly, arms crossed. "State your business, Jeremiah, and then kindly get off my land." "My business is simple." His gaze slid toward Ethan, who worked near the corral within easy earshot and had not once looked up. "This ranch is too much for one woman, even with a drifter's help propping it up. I'll offer you a fair price, more than fair, and you'll never have to worry about another hard winter again." "My answer hasn't changed since the last 3 times you asked," Clara said. "This land isn't for sale, and it never will be." Jeremiah's smile stayed fixed in place even as his eyes turned cold as the creek in January. "Winters have a way of changing minds, Mrs. Whitmore. I'd hate to see you lose everything for stubbornness alone." He rode off without waiting for a reply, dust settling behind him, and Clara stood watching until the sound of hooves faded entirely, a familiar knot of worry returning low in her stomach. Ethan approached quietly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Trouble?" "He wants my land," Clara said. "He's wanted it since before my husband was even cold in the ground. I always assumed he'd tire of asking eventually." "Men like that don't tire," Ethan said. "They wait for weakness, and they manufacture it if they have to." "Then we'd better not show him any," Clara answered, and for the first time, she said we without noticing she had said it at all. That night, Ethan walked the fence line twice before turning in, lantern swinging low against the dark. He found nothing wrong, though the quiet unsettled him more than a broken rail would have. Some men announced their intentions with fists. Jeremiah Blackwell announced his with polite smiles and patient timing, and patient men, Ethan had learned long ago, were the ones worth watching closest. "You're out here late," Clara said, appearing at the barn door with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "Making sure the fence stays a fence," Ethan said. "Blackwell doesn't strike me as a man who waits quietly for a second no." "He's never had to before," Clara admitted. Most folks around here fold once he starts circling. I'm not most folks, Ethan said simply, and Clara found she believed him completely. Hearts begin to heal. Winter crept closer, but so did something neither Clara nor Ethan had expected to find again. Small moments accumulated like snow before a real storm. A shared laugh over Luke's brave attempt to milk a cow entirely by himself, which ended with more milk on his shirt than in the pail. A quiet conversation on the porch after both boys had fallen asleep. Ethan showing Clara a repair trick his own father once taught him, his rough hand briefly resting over hers on the handle of the tool. You've got sawdust in your hair, Ethan said one evening, reaching to brush it away before catching himself and stepping back a half pace too late. You've got a habit of noticing things you shouldn't, Clara said, though she did not step away first, and the porch light caught the small smile she failed to hide. Daisy, entirely unbothered by the tension building between the two adults, chose that exact moment to go chasing after Luke's stolen boot straight between them, sending both boys tumbling into a fit of laughter that broke whatever careful silence had been building on the porch steps. Ben caught Clara's eye afterward and grinned, wise beyond his 10 years. Daisy likes you both. She's usually right about people, my ma used to say. Is that so? Clara said, cheeks warm despite the cold evening air settling over the valley. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, Ethan found Clara sitting alone on the porch steps, staring up at a sky crowded with more stars than the town ever showed. I never planned on staying anywhere long, he admitted, sitting beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Didn't seem fair to my boys, getting attached somewhere we'd only have to leave again come spring. And now? Clara asked softly. Now I'm not entirely sure I remember how to leave, Ethan said, his voice low and honest in a way that surprised even himself. Clara did not answer with words. She simply let her hand rest beside his on the worn wooden step, close enough that their fingers touched, and neither of them pulled away for a long, quiet while, the whole valley holding its breath around them. Sabotage in the snow. The first sign of trouble came with a section of fence found cut clean, not broken by weather or wildlife, near the northern range. Then feed stores went missing from the barn overnight, more than could be explained by careless counting. Rumors began circulating in town that Clara Whitmore had taken up with a drifter of questionable character, rumors that traced back, unmistakably, to Jeremiah's circle of well-dressed friends. Ben found the truth entirely by accident. Sent to fetch a drop tool near the property line, he overheard Jeremiah speaking with a hired man behind a stand of trees, offering payment for damage done quietly and blamed afterward on nothing more than bad weather. Ben ran home breathless, though fear kept him from speaking right away once he arrived. Nobody believes a kid over a rich man, he finally told his father that night, voice shaking despite his best effort to sound grown. But I heard him, Pa. I heard every word he said, clear as anything. Ethan knelt to meet his son's eyes, steady and serious. I believe you, and that's what matters first. We'll find a way to make sure everyone else believes it too, before this goes any further. Clara, listening from the doorway, felt anger rise sharper than fear ever could. He's been circling this ranch since my husband died, waiting for a reason to finally call it his own. I will not let him take it through lies and cut fences while I stand by quiet. Then we get proof, Ethan said. Sheriff Briggs is an honest man, and honest men respect evidence over rumor. We bring him what we know, and we watch the property closer until we've caught more than a boy's overheard conversation. For the first time since Lydia's death, Ethan felt something besides grief guiding his hands through each day. He felt purpose again, and beside him stood a woman who refused to be pushed out of her own life by a man with more money than character. The longest night. The blizzard arrived on the eve of the season's worst cold snap, exactly as Jeremiah had quietly planned it to. Under cover of the coming storm, his hired man cut the northern fence wide open, hoping the herd would scatter into the mountains and force Clara into a sale she could no longer refuse. The cattle stampeded before anyone realized the fence had failed. Daisy barked frantically near the broken rail, her warning lost beneath the howling wind. Luke, chasing after her into the swirling snow before Ethan could stop him, disappeared past the tree line within seconds. Ben ran after his brother, only to find himself trapped trying to pull 3 newborn calves from a drainage ditch as the storm closed in tighter around him with every passing minute. Clara rushed into the white oat screaming both boys' names, her voice torn away by the wind almost as soon as it left her mouth. The old bridge groaned beneath her boots before a section gave way entirely, dropping her into the freezing creek below. Ethan arrived to a nightmare unfolding in every direction at once. He tied a rope around his waist and anchored the other end to the old cottonwood tree near the barn, refusing to wait one more second for help that might arrive far too late to matter. He found Luke first, curled against a rock with Daisy pressed protectively against him, both of them shivering but very much alive. He carried the boy back through the storm before turning around and going back out for Ben, who had refused to abandon the calves even as the cold crept deep into his fingers and turned his lips blue. Finally, Ethan waded into the freezing creek and pulled Clara from the water moments before the remaining ice gave way completely beneath where she had been standing. Using every windbreak, marker post, and lantern signal he had built through the long autumn months, Ethan guided the scattered herd back toward shelter before dawn finally broke over the exhausted valley. Nearly every animal survived the night, an outcome that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not watched him prepare so carefully for exactly this kind of storm. Wrapped in blankets by the stove afterward, soaked and trembling but together, Clara reached for Ethan's hand across the small space between them. "You could have died out there," she said quietly, her voice raw from the cold and the fear both. "So could you," he answered. "Seemed like a fair trade, keeping this family whole." It was the first time either of them had said the word family aloud, and neither one took it back. Ben, wrapped in a second blanket near the stove, watched the two of them with the quiet satisfaction of a boy who had spent months hoping for exactly this. Luke, already half asleep against Daisy's warm side, mumbled something about the calves being safe now, and nobody corrected him even though the counting would have to wait until morning. Outside, the wind finally began to lose its fury, dropping from a scream to a low, tired moan against the barn walls. By the time the eastern sky turned the color of ash and then slowly to pale gold, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a valley buried in white but, against every reasonable expectation, still very much alive. Truth beneath the snow. Morning revealed what the blizzard had tried its hardest to bury. Fresh tracks near the cut fence, mismatched with any of Clara's own hands, led straight toward Jeremiah's property line, plain as ink on paper for anyone willing to look. Sheriff Owen Briggs arrived at first light, following up on Ben's earlier account and the physical evidence the storm had failed to erase completely despite its best effort. Jeremiah denied everything at first, standing tall in his own parlor as though wealth alone could argue his case for him. His hired man, facing the sheriff's questions alone and unwilling to take a criminal charge for another man's greed, confessed the entire scheme within the hour. "You cut an innocent woman's fence during the worst storm of the year," Sheriff Briggs said, standing firm with the signed confession in hand. "2 children nearly died out there, Blackwell." This stopped being a business dispute the moment that fence came apart. Jeremiah's composure finally cracked at the edges. "It was only land," he muttered, though even he seemed to hear how hollow the excuse sounded once it left his mouth. "It was somebody's home," the sheriff answered simply, and placed him under arrest without another word wasted on the matter. News traveled fast through Silver Creek Valley, the way news always does in small places. Neighbors who had once repeated the ugly rumors about Clara now arrived at her gate with apologies and offers to help rebuild the fence line before the next storm arrived. Martha Dawson arrived first, of course, declaring loudly to anyone within earshot that she had never once doubted Ethan Cole's character. "Told you kindness would outlast greed eventually," Martha said, patting Clara's arm with satisfaction. "Just took a blizzard to prove it to the rest of this valley." Later, alone with Ethan by the mended fence, Clara finally allowed herself to laugh, a real laugh, the first true one in longer than she could remember. "An underground spring," she said, shaking her head at the sheriff's final report. "All of this, and it turns out my land was worth more than even Jeremiah realized. He wasn't only after the cattle grazing on top of it. Seems the valley's been sitting on more than either of us knew," Ethan said. though I'd have stayed for far less than a hidden spring. The home they never planned to find. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did after a hard Wyoming winter, but it arrived all the same. The ranch that had nearly been lost stood stronger than before, its fences mended, its herd intact and grazing peacefully, its house full of noise that no longer felt strange to Clara's ears at all. Ethan found her by the barn one clear morning, packing tools into his handcart with slow, reluctant hands that did not match the determined set of his jaw. "You're leaving," Clara said, though it came out sounding more like a question than she had intended. "I told myself I'd only stay until the ranch was steady again," Ethan said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Didn't want my boys getting too settled someplace we might still have to leave behind." "And now the ranch is steady," Clara said. "Now the ranch is steady," he agreed quietly, though his hands had stopped moving entirely. Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a set of ranch keys, pressing them firmly into his open palm before he could find a reason to protest. "You asked me for one night in my barn," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering unshed in her eyes. "I'm asking for the rest of your life." Ethan looked down at the keys resting in his palm, then toward Ben and Luke racing across the yard with Daisy barking joyfully at their heels, and finally back at Clara, who had opened her gate to strangers one cold September evening and somehow found her own family waiting on the other side of it. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above the wind. "I've never been more certain of anything in my whole life," Clara said. "Family doesn't always arrive the way we expect it to. Sometimes it walks up wearing worn boots, asking only for one small kindness. The trick, I've learned, is recognizing it before it has any reason to walk away again." Ethan closed his hand around the keys and, for the first time since Lydia's passing, allowed himself to believe that settling down was not a weakness at all, but the bravest thing a tired man could choose to do. By summer, the whole valley knew the story of the widow and the drifter who had saved each other's lives, though those who knew them best understood the truth ran simpler than any version passed around at the general store. A stranger had asked for one night of shelter. A widow had chosen kindness over caution. And two boys who had nearly forgotten what a real home felt like found one waiting behind a gate that never should have opened that first night, yet did anyway. The lesson of Silver Creek Valley outlived the gossip and the changing seasons both. Trust is earned through actions, never through promises alone. Preparation before hardship saves more lives than courage during it ever can. And love, when it is real and worth keeping, rarely announces itself loudly. It simply shows up early, works quietly before dawn without asking for credit, and stays long after anyone thought to expect it would. Martha Dawson liked to tell it a little differently whenever new neighbors moved into the valley, usually over a fresh loaf of bread nobody had asked her to bring. She would say a tired man knocked on a widow's gate looking for nothing more than one dry night for his sons, and the widow, against every careful instinct grief had taught her, chose to open it anyway. Everything good that followed, Martha insisted, grew straight out of that single decision. Ben grew into the kind of rancher neighbors trusted with their own herds, quiet and steady like his father before him. Luke never did stop trying to teach Daisy new tricks, though the old dog had long since decided which boot was her favorite and refused to be fooled twice. And on quiet evenings, when the work was finally done and the lanterns were lit against the dark, Ethan and Clara would sit together on the same porch steps where they had first let their hands touch, grateful that one small kindness, offered on the coldest night of a hard September, had grown into a lifetime neither of them had dared to plan for, yet both had somehow found waiting for them all along.